Welcome to Crime Before Modern Law. Here, we explore how crime and justice functioned before modern policing. If you find this topic interesting, feel free to leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you would like to support the channel, a like or subscription always helps. In the Middle Ages, there was no police department like we think of today. There were no detectives with badges, no full-time patrol force across the whole country, and no modern laboratories. Yet medieval people still had to answer the same basic problem. When a crime happened, who noticed it, who gathered information, who caught suspects, and who brought the case into a court? The short answer is that medieval investigation was shared work. It was done by victims and neighbors first, then by local officers, and finally by higher authorities who held courts and demanded formal reports. The system depended on community obligation, public reputation, sworn statements, and local record-keeping. To understand who investigated crimes in the Middle Ages, it helps to think in layers. First layer, the community as the first investigator. Most medieval people lived in villages or small towns where everyone knew each other. When something went wrong, the first investigation was usually a matter of immediate observation and common knowledge. If a theft happened, a victim might notice missing property and ask neighbors what they had seen. If someone was attacked on a road, travelers and nearby households might become witnesses. If a suspicious death occurred, the body would be found by ordinary people, and the first question would be simple: who found the body, where, and in what condition? Medieval investigations leaned heavily on eyewitness reports, local rumor, and a person's reputation. A key idea was that communities were expected to know their own members. If a stranger appeared, that fact mattered. If a person had a history of quarrels or violence, that was remembered. If someone fled after a crime, that was also strong evidence in the medieval mind. This community-centered approach had strengths and weaknesses. It could respond quickly because neighbors were already present. But it also meant that social pressure, fear of powerful families, and local grudges could shape what people said. Second layer, compulsory communal action, hue and cry. One of the clearest medieval tools for pursuing criminals was a practice often called hue and cry. When a serious crime was witnessed, people were expected to raise an alarm. The alarm was not just shouting. It was a public call for help that could require able-bodied men to join a chase, block roads, and pass the alarm from one settlement to the next. This was not mainly about careful detective work. It was about fast capture. The logic was simple. If a criminal was caught quickly, the case was easier. Stolen goods might still be nearby. Injured people might still be alive. Witnesses would still be gathered in one place. In this system, failing to respond could bring trouble to the community. In many areas, the law treated crime control as a shared duty. If the community did not make a reasonable effort to pursue offenders, the village or local district could face punishment or fines. Third layer, local offices, constables, watchmen, and tithing men. Although medieval Europe did not have modern police, it did have local officials with peacekeeping duties. Constables. In England, the constable became a central local officer for keeping order. Constables were usually unpaid and part-time. They were not trained investigators in the modern sense. Their job was to organize community duties and respond to trouble. A constable might help organize the local night watch, take part in arrests, present suspected offenders to higher courts, make sure local legal duties were carried out. Watch and ward. Towns and larger settlements often organized night watching. Watchmen were expected to challenge strangers, notice suspicious movement, and detain people found wandering at night under questionable circumstances. This was a form of prevention and early detection. It did not solve every crime, but it increased the chance that suspicious people would be questioned before they could disappear. In practice, watchmen were not silent observers. They were active community members carrying out a duty. If they detained someone overnight, that person could be brought before local authorities in the morning. Tithings and frank pledge. In many places, medieval order relied on group responsibility. In parts of England, adult men were grouped into units often described as tithings, connected to a broader system called frank pledge. The idea was that ordinary people were answerable for each other's behavior in a practical way. This mattered for investigation because it created a built-in information network. If someone in a group was suspected of wrongdoing, others in the group might be expected to help locate him, report him, or bring him to court. If a person disappeared, the group might be questioned about where he went. This was not a detective bureau. It was a social structure that pushed communities to monitor themselves. Fourth layer, local courts and community reporting, presentment. A major part of medieval criminal investigation happened through formal reporting to courts. Instead of a state prosecutor building a case through professional investigators, medieval systems often relied on community members to present offences, meaning they reported them formally to an authority. In English settings, this could occur through juries of presentment or similar sworn groups. These were not trial juries in the modern sense. They were bodies of local men who reported under oath what crimes were believed to have occurred, who was suspected, and what was publicly known. In a manor or local district, the people who owed attendance at court might be required to report assaults and disturbances, theft and trespass, violations of local rules like weights and measures, failure to join required groups or fulfill duties. This system placed investigation close to the ground. The law expected local people to know what was happening and to speak under oath in an organized way. Fifth layer, the sheriff and the 100 court. Above village-level officials stood county-level authorities. In medieval England, the sheriff was one of the most important royal officers in a county. The sheriff's work combined administration, finance, and justice. For criminal matters, the sheriff could receive prisoners or suspects, organize the holding of certain courts, ensure accused persons appeared before the king's justices, carry out orders such as summonses and custody. The sheriff also oversaw periodic gatherings connected to hundreds, which were regional divisions smaller than a county. The 100 court could be a place where offences were reported and where local order was supervised. One event tied to this system was the sheriff's turn, an inspection held at set times. During it, the sheriff reviewed local responsibilities, including the functioning of the frank pledge system. This was partly about keeping order and partly about making sure the king's rights and revenues were protected. This reveals something important. Medieval investigation often blended public safety with royal administration. Crime control and government finance were not fully separate. A felony conviction could lead to forfeiture of goods, which mattered to the crown. Sixth layer, the coroner. Investigation of suspicious death. When a dead body was found under violent, sudden, or unclear circumstances, a special official could become involved, the coroner. In medieval England, the office of coroner emerged as a crown office in the late 12th century. The coroner was not simply a medical official. The coroner's job was tied to recording and protecting the crown's interests in serious cases. Coroners held inquests. An inquest gathered local men as jurors to answer official questions about a death. They would consider who the dead person was, where the body was found, how the death seemed to have happened, whether someone was suspected, whether property should be seized because of a felony or suicide. This mattered because deaths were legally meaningful. If someone was killed, it could be homicide. If someone died by suicide, medieval law might treat it as a serious offense with property consequences. The coroner's record helped ensure the case was reported properly when higher royal justices came later. The coroner's process shows a key medieval method: investigation by sworn local knowledge, organized by an official, and written into a formal record. Seventh layer, justices of the peace and the growing role of local magistrates. Over time, England developed the office of Justice of the Peace. By the 14th century, statutes gave these justices important responsibilities in dealing with disorder and offenders. Justices of the peace were local men of status appointed to keep the peace. They were not modern investigators, but they could receive complaints, order arrests or detentions, examine suspected offenders or witnesses in some settings, oversee local administration of order. This marks a shift. Earlier systems leaned more on broad communal obligation. With justices of the peace, you see stronger local authority acting as the Crown's representative, supervising peacekeeping in a more organized way. What investigation looked like without modern tools. Medieval investigation did not rely on fingerprints, DNA, or surveillance. Instead, it relied on a set of practical methods. 1. Immediate capture and pursuit. Catching a suspect quickly mattered more than building a complex case later. A person caught with stolen goods or caught in the act faced a very different situation than a suspect identified weeks afterward. 2. Public knowledge and reputation. Communities kept long memories. People were known by their behavior, their disputes, and their alliances. Courts and jurors often treated local reputation as meaningful evidence. 3. Witness testimony and sworn statements. If a person saw a crime, that testimony mattered. If a group of locals swore that a person was widely suspected, that could also matter. 4. Physical signs and simple inspection. In cases of death or injury, officials and jurors might look at wounds and the condition of a body. In many cases, they did not have medical expertise, but they did use observation. Sometimes medical practitioners could be consulted, but this was not routine in the way it is today. 5. Written records for later royal justice. Even when local courts acted quickly, serious cases could be carried forward into higher royal courts. Records kept by coroners and local officials mattered because they preserved information until visiting judges arrived. How local and central power fit together. A medieval criminal investigation often moved from local action to higher judgment. A victim and neighbors raised alarm and tried to catch the offender. Local officers like constables or watchmen detained suspects. Community representatives reported offences in court sessions. Sheriffs managed custody and county-level process. Coroners documented suspicious deaths and felony matters. Royal justices or higher courts handled major trials and punishments. This flow could be slow by modern standards, especially if higher judges came only periodically. That delay is one reason medieval systems depended so much on local reporting and record-keeping. Differences across medieval Europe. The Middle Ages covered many regions and many centuries, so no single model fits everywhere. In parts of continental Europe, criminal procedure developed in ways that gave judges a more active role in gathering evidence, sometimes described as inquisitorial in the procedural sense. In other places, accusing and proving a case remained more directly tied to private individuals and local communities. Even where procedures differed, the same basic pattern appears again and again. Investigation was usually not the job of a professional force. Community members were expected to assist. Local officials organized the response. Higher authorities relied on local information. Limits and pressures in medieval investigations. Medieval investigation could be effective in some situations, especially in small communities where suspects were known and quick pursuit was possible. But it had built-in limits. Crimes by strangers were harder to solve. Crimes committed secretly, without witnesses, were difficult to prove. Local power could distort outcomes, because wealthy or influential families could pressure witnesses. Travel was slow and information moved slowly. Detaining and transporting suspects required local resources. Because of these limits, medieval legal systems often emphasized prevention, public responsibility, and immediate pursuit more than long-term detective work. Why this matters for understanding who investigated. When asking who investigated crimes in the Middle Ages, it helps to replace a modern image, police detectives and forensic experts, with a medieval structure built on obligation and local authority. Investigation was not a single job title, it was a chain of duties shared across society. The victim started the complaint and gathered help. The neighbors became witnesses, pursuers, and sworn reporters. Constables and watchmen organized detention and local order. Tithing structures and group responsibility created local accountability. Sheriffs connected local action to county and royal justice. Coroners investigated suspicious deaths through inquests and written records. Justices of the peace, later on, strengthened local control and oversight. This system was not modern, but it was not lawless. It was a different kind of law enforcement, communal first, official second, and strongly tied to courts and sworn local knowledge. In the end, medieval crime investigation worked best when the community was able and willing to act quickly, when local officials could organize that action, and when higher courts could rely on local records and sworn testimony to reach decisions. That is how many medieval societies tried to find truth, assign responsibility, and keep order long before modern policing existed.